Alright, listen up, Trailblazers. If you want to stay ahead in Honkai Star Rail, you have to build characters from different paths and combat types. Endgame modes like the Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction reset every 2 weeks, and the enemies in them? Yeah, they're always switching things up. You can't just stick to one team and hope for the best, especially since these modes give you 5 pulls every time they reset. That's basically free rewards just for playing smart. And trust me, you don't want to miss out on those juicy stellar jades. Now let's talk about ice characters. This combat type has had a bit of a roller coaster ride in the meta. Back at launch, ice units were tearing through content like a blizzard, but over time, they kinda lost their edge. That is, until the Herta dropped in version 3.0 and shook everything up. So today, we're diving into every single ice character in the game. Who's still worth using, who's fallen off, and which ones you should definitely build for those tough endgame fights. Let's get into it. I'm quickly moving on to the video. Before we start, if you enjoy these types of list videos, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Enjoy watching. Misha is one of those characters that had so much potential, but somehow, he just doesn't quite hit the mark in Honkai Star Rail's meta. He's a 4-star destruction unit, and while that sounds great on paper, his kit is kind of all over the place. There's no clear playstyle for him, which is a huge drawback in a game where synergy is everything. If you're thinking about building him, you're going to need to get creative because he doesn't exactly fit neatly into any team comp. Now don't get me wrong, Misha isn't completely useless. His ultimate is actually pretty solid, dealing multiple hits to enemies and shredding their toughness bar at a rapid pace. On top of that, there's a chance to freeze enemies, which is always nice for some extra crowd control. The problem? He scales entirely on ATK, so stacking break effect to fully utilize those constant toughness breaks just isn't viable. It's like he's stuck between 2 different playstyles but doesn't fully commit to either. At the end of the day, Misha is a fun character, but he's definitely not a must-pick for ice teams. If you love his design or just want to experiment, go for it. But if you're looking for a strong ice DPS or breaker, there are simply better options out there. Maybe one day he'll get a buff or some synergy with future characters. But for now, he's more of a niche pick rather than a meta staple. March 7th is one of the first characters you'll get in Honkai Star Rail, and for many players, she's their introduction to the preservation path. She's a shielding unit, which sounds great in theory, but there's a catch. Her shield only applies to one ally at a time. That ally also gets a higher chance of being targeted, which can be useful in specific situations, but doesn't always work out in the current meta. Now, if you're running characters like Blade or Yunli, who thrive when they get hit, March 7th can actually be a solid pick. Her shield keeps them protected while ensuring they take enough damage to activate their passives. But here's the problem. Most enemies in the game love to spam AoE attacks, and a single target shield won't do much against that. When everyone's getting hit, protecting just one ally often isn't enough to keep your team alive. That being said, she's still a great unit for early game and certain niche strategies. If you're a fan of counter-focused teams or just love her personality, she can definitely find a place in your lineup. But if you're looking for a top-tier shielder, characters like Fu Xuan or Gepard will usually do a better job at keeping your team safe. Yan King is one of those characters that just can't catch a break. Not in the story, and definitely not in the game's meta. As a standard 5-star, he already suffers from the usual issue of being outclassed by limited banner units. But the real problem? He's locked into the hunt path, meaning he's all about single target damage. And in Honkai Star Rail, that's a serious limitation when most fights throw waves of enemies at you. If you've spent any time in the game's endgame modes, you know that AoE damage is king. Simulated Universe and Pure Fiction both favor characters who can hit multiple enemies at once, and even Memory of Chaos tends to throw in extra mobs that make pure single-target DPS feel underwhelming. That means Yan King struggles to keep up, even if he does decent damage when built properly. The fact that he also relies on staying untouched for his buff up time just makes things worse. One stray hit, and his power drops off significantly. That being said, if you like Yan King and want to use him, he can still shine in certain situations. He works well against single bosses that don't summon adds, and his self-buffing mechanics mean he can dish out some solid crit-heavy damage when left alone. But in a game where versatility is key, Yan King just doesn't have what it takes to keep up with the top-tier DPS units. Gepard is one of those characters who has been solid since day one, and for good reason. Sustainers have always been crucial in Honkai. Star Rail. If you're lacking a strong defensive unit, he's definitely worth upgrading. His massive team-wide shield can absorb a ton of damage, making fights significantly easier, especially in difficult content. But before you invest too much into him, there's one big question to ask. Do you have a better sustainer? The truth is, while Gepard is good, he's not exactly the best option out there. Unlike Fu Xuan, Aventurine, Lingsha, Luocha, or Huohuo, he doesn't offer healing, energy regeneration, or extra team buffs. Just pure shielding. And in a game where sustain units need to be flexible, that can be a bit of a downside. He's great for teams that want a sturdy frontline, but if you have a top-tier healer or a shielder with extra utility, Gepard's value starts to drop. That being said, if you don't have those stronger sustainers, Gepard can still carry your team through a lot of tough fights. His ultimate ensures your entire squad stays protected, and with the right build, he becomes an unkillable tank. He may not be the flashiest sustain unit, but when it comes to keeping your team alive, he still gets the job done. Herta is one of those characters that went from completely forgettable to surprisingly strong thanks to recent updates. Back in the early days of Honkai Star Rail, she was often overlooked due to her low damage and lack of real impact in fights. But as more follow-up attack characters entered the game, she started to find her place again. And then came the Herta, the mini version of herself that completely turned things around for her. The real game changer, though, was the introduction of Pure Fiction. This mode rewards characters who can dish out constant AoE damage, and that's exactly what Herta excels at. With her passive follow-up attacks triggering whenever enemies drop below a certain HP threshold, she can clear waves of enemies effortlessly. In some cases, she even outperforms the top-tier DPS units just because of how often she gets free damage in. So, is Herta worth building now? If you're looking for a solid AoE follow-up attacker, absolutely. She's no longer just the free character you bench forever. She has a real role in certain team comps, especially in Pure Fiction. She might not be the strongest erudition unit overall, but when it comes to wave clearing, she's definitely back in business. Jingliu was an absolute game changer when she first dropped. She didn't just hit hard, she obliterated the competition, setting damage records and making every other DPS look second-rate. For a while, she was the undisputed queen of raw damage, outshining even the next best units by a massive margin. But as with all things in Honkai Star Rail, the meta moved on, and unfortunately, Jingliu started to slip. The biggest issue? Power creep and a shift in playstyle. Newer DPS characters started dealing more consistent damage rather than relying on burst, and the meta itself shifted toward follow-up attack and break effect teams. While Jingliu still packs a serious punch, there's always someone who fits the current game modes just a little bit better. And when you're investing in a top-tier unit, versatility is just as important as damage. That said, Jingliu is by no means a bad unit. If you love her playstyle and already have the right supports, she's still an absolute powerhouse in the right situations. She just isn't the must-have monster she once was. If you're after the absolute best DPS for the current meta, there are other options. But if you enjoy her aggressive, sacrifice-based mechanics, she's still an incredibly fun unit to play. Pila is one of those rare 4-star units that has never fallen off, even after countless updates. From day one, she's been a staple in debuff-heavy teams, and she still holds her ground in the meta today. Her ultimate is simple but insanely effective. A full team-wide DF shred that lets your damage dealers hit way harder. And the best part? You can easily maintain 100% uptime on this debuff, meaning your team gets a permanent damage boost. But what really keeps Pela relevant is the lack of solid debuffers in the game. Right now, the only real competition she has is Silver Wolf and Jiaoqiu, but they both have their own drawbacks. Silver Wolf is a single-target debuffer, which doesn't work as well in AoE fights, and Jiaoqiu has a more complex setup. Pela, on the other hand, is just plug-and-play. She works in almost any team and doesn't need a ton of investment to perform. So, if you're still on the fence about building her, don't be. She's easily one of the best 4-stars in Honkai Star Rail, and the fact that she's still meta after all this time says a lot. If you need a reliable support that boosts your entire team's damage effortlessly, Pela is an absolute no-brainer. Ruan Mei is one of those characters that instantly changed the game the moment she was released. Harmony units have always been ridiculously strong, Just look at Bronya, who's been top tier since day one. So when a limited Harmony unit showed up, you knew she was going to be broken. And sure enough, Ruin Mei didn't disappoint. Her biggest strength? Toughness shredding. She makes it way easier to break enemies, which is a game changer in break effect teams. But even if you're not running a full break-based setup, she's still an insane support. She buffs ATK, increases RES pen, and just makes everyone on your team hit harder. Unlike some supports who only shine in niche situations, Ruin Mei fits into almost any comp and makes a massive impact. If you're still wondering whether she's worth pulling for, yes, absolutely. She's one of the most valuable supports in the game, and the fact that she enables both break-focused and general DPS teams makes her incredibly flexible. If you have her, she's 100% worth building, and if you don't, well, you might regret skipping her. Remembrance Trailblazer was an absolute game changer when she dropped in version 3.0. Nobody expected the free unit to be this strong, but here we are. The fact that you can get her all the way to Eidolon 6 for free already makes her a must build, but what really sets her apart is the true DMG mechanic. Her entire gimmick revolves around amplifying your team's DPS by dealing true DMG every time an ally attacks. And the best part? It scales off your main DPS's damage output. So if you've got a high damage unit like Jingliu, Blade, or Danheng IL, you're going to see some ridiculous extra damage numbers pop up. Plus, since she's just another Trailblazer form, you don't even need to farm new resources for her if you've already built the previous ones. At the end of the day, she's free, she's strong, and she fits into almost any team. What more could you ask for? If you haven't built her yet, you're definitely missing out on some easy extra damage. The Herta is a perfect example of how a well-designed character can completely flip the meta. When she was released, it was clear that the erudition path was making a comeback, and the Herta was the driving force behind it. A genius from the Herta space station, she's not just some character with flashy visuals, she's an absolute powerhouse. As an emanator, her lore already hints at her immense potential, and that power is more than realized in gameplay. One of the most mind-blowing things about the Herta is her damage scaling. She can easily hit 100k damage with her skill, but when you activate her ultimate and buff her skill correctly, that number explodes into the millions. And get this, even if you're free to play, you can still clear all the endgame content without much trouble. The Herta isn't just about raw damage. She's versatile and can carry you through some of the toughest battles in the game. If you haven't built her yet, now is the time. Whether you're a seasoned player or a newer one, the Herta is one of the best ice characters to build in Honkai Star Rail, and she can definitely hold her own in pretty much any content you throw at her. The video ends here. See you in another video. Don't forget to subscribe.